Okay, so our last speaker for this morning's session is Dr. Srividya Iyer. She's our program coordinator at the PEP clinic. She's also a clinical psychologist and also a researcher and an assistant professor in psychiatry at McGill University. And her talk will be about neurocognitive deficit and functional outcome in early psychosis.
So I know that everyone's eagerly waiting for lunch, so I'll try and see if I can sustain everyone's attention. Like all the work at PEP, my presentation is also based on a team effort. I'd like to especially acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Ashok Mala, and all my colleagues who've really helped, particularly with this presentation: Gina Marandola, Gerald Jordan, Dr. Marita Prusner, Nicole Polyuk, Dr. Lepage and his lab, and the entire PEP team, especially the clients who give their time to participate in all the assessments that are conducted at PEP. So as you can clearly tell, that neurocognition has received a lot of attention in early psychosis research. And within this, sort of broadly speaking, and not talking about the neuroimaging research, within this, 3 areas have been looked at. How do persons with psychosis and those who are at risk for developing psychosis perform cognitively compared to their peers of the same age or roughly the same background? How do these cognitive abilities contribute to clinical and functional outcomes? And how do these cognitive abilities relate to various other illness aspects? And my presentation will primarily focus on I'm not very good at using the pointer, I guess. My presentation will primarily focus on level of deficits and the contribution of cognitive abilities to treatment outcomes and functioning. Just a very, very simplistic 2-minute primer, because I know it's a very mixed audience here, on neurocognitive assessment in first episode psychosis. These are sort of the domains that are typically looked at: attention, verbal memory. So for example, how much would you recall from a story or a list of words presented to you? Visual memory, like so how much would you recall of figures presented to you? Working memory, so if I asked you to listen to the numbers 5, 9, 8, 6, 3, and turn them backward in your mind and then repeat them aloud to me, that would be an example of a working memory task. And more complex functions of reasoning and problem solving, also often called executive functions. The speed at which you perform cognitive tasks and process information, so processing speed. And finally, global cognition, so which is more or less like a composite score reflecting all these cognitive abilities. So this is sort of a follow-up to some of the data that Michael presented earlier. So what you can see here, the green line is the cognitive performance of persons with first episode psychosis followed at PEP. And you can see that on all domains, persons with psychosis tend to perform lower than controls of roughly than their peers, okay? Areas of particular impairment seem to be global cognition, so which is more or less generalized difficulty in cognitive areas, verbal memory, and reasoning and problem solving. And this is very consistent with all the research that has been presented this morning so far, showing that persons with psychosis tend to have multiple cognitive deficits. So this is sort of, again, it's somewhat along the lines of what Dr. Borgwat earlier presented. This is looking at the cognitive performance of persons who are at ultra-high risk for developing psychosis followed in our care clinic. And what you can see here, the brown line is the performance of those at high risk for developing psychosis. And on 3 areas, they seemed to perform lower than their peers. And those areas were, the lowest area was processing speed, followed by verbal memory, and finally followed by global cognition, reflecting again this sort of generalized deficit in multiple cognitive areas. Relative to the research on cognition in first episode psychosis, the research on neurocognition in persons who are at high risk for developing psychosis is a bit more recent, and there have been some more inconsistent findings, but these two more recent papers, the review in 2010 and the meta-analysis by Dr. Borgwat and his group in 2012, sort of fit with what we have found in our group, that there seem to be impairments in multiple cognitive areas in persons who are at high risk for developing psychosis. Now, sort of an important focus of neurocognition research in ultra-high risk has been also to try and identify which cognitive areas seem to predict whether or not people would go on to experience a first episode of psychosis. I would say fortunately we haven't had a very high rate of conversion in our group, so we weren't really able to examine this question. But we did find, just when we looked at a correlation between positive symptoms such as hearing voices, we found a significant correlation between verbal memory and positive symptoms, which again would be consistent with a lot of the literature demonstrating the importance of verbal memory. What's sort of interesting is that given the large number of papers you would find looking at objective neuropsychological assessments and what they seem to reveal about the performance of persons with psychosis and those at risk, very little attention has been paid to how persons with psychosis and those at risk themselves evaluate their cognitive abilities. So we tried to sort of look at the subjective perception of cognition using the STIX, which is a subjective scale to investigate cognition in schizophrenia, which has been developed here in Montreal by Emmanuel Stipp and his team. And it's a very simple questionnaire that basically asks people to rate their own sort of performance or level of difficulty in various tasks that pertain to various cognitive domains. So we administered the STIX to persons with first episode psychosis, to those at risk for developing psychosis followed in our care program, and to sort of their peers in the community. And what we found is that on 4 of those areas, those that you see sort of highlighted in the graph there, both persons with first episode psychosis and those at high risk for developing psychosis saw themselves as performing lower. So they saw themselves as having more level of difficulties, cognitive difficulties in general compared to peers, as is reflected in the total. And specifically, they saw themselves as having difficulties in attention, explicit memory, and executive functions. Now, what's interesting is that in all 4 of these domains, there seemed to be no difference between how persons with first episode psychosis and those at risk saw themselves. That is, they both saw themselves as having the same level of difficulty in these areas, which is kind of interesting and fits very well what we've been talking about all morning about the level of distress that distress and difficulty and dysfunction that people who are at risk may have, irrespective of whether or not they go on to convert to a first episode of psychosis. On these 2 particular areas, working memory and language, what we found is that people followed at PEP, that's people followed for their first episode of psychosis, did not see themselves as having any more difficulty than their peers. But even in these 2 areas, people who were followed for ultra-high risk in our care program saw themselves as having more difficulty than persons with first episode psychosis and their peers in the community. Sort of a logical question then to ask would be, how do these subjectively assessed cognitive abilities correspond to objectively assessed cognitive abilities? And what we found is that we found no correlations between self-perceived cognitive functioning and objective measures of cognition. And if you look at the literature on this topic, there's very little literature looking at this assessment in early psychosis, but if you sort of broaden it to the entire field of psychosis and schizophrenia, there are many, many inconsistent findings with many recent studies showing the same pattern of limited correspondence between self-perceived cognitive functioning and objective measures of cognition. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean that persons with psychosis or those at risk have impaired sort of awareness or impaired metacognition or impaired awareness of their own cognitive abilities? Or to some extent, does it reflect that our objective measures may have somewhat limited ecological validity or limited sort of relevance to everyday cognitive tasks or correspondence to everyday cognitive tasks? It also reflects the fact that subjective scales to assess subjective deficits, there are many, many out there, so a variety of measures have been used, and many of them have very sort of poorly constructed factors based on limited sample sizes, which could be playing a role here. And what I really am partial to is sort of the last sort of explanation, which is that self-perceived cognitive functioning seems to be influenced not just by where people stand objectively in terms of their cognitive abilities, but also by various other sort of clinical and important psychological variables. So for example, what we found is that the same group of people who saw themselves as having more cognitive difficulties also tended to have lower self-esteem. They had a higher level of positive symptoms, a higher level of depression, and a higher level of anxiety. And in our ultra-high-risk group, we found that poorer self-perceived cognitive functioning was associated with a higher level of positive symptoms. Sort of moving on, now that we've sort of briefly talked about objective and subjective deficits and sort of built on what we've been discussing earlier during this session, if we move on to sort of talking about the links between cognition and functional outcomes. For a long, long time, it's sort of been taken as an established idea that neurocognition has a very important role to play in predicting functional outcomes. And this paper here that I have included in my slide is a very sort of seminal paper and often cited paper by Michael Green, indicating the particular role of verbal memory and what a big role it seems to play in predicting functional outcomes. So what we wanted to do was really look at this a bit more in detail. So the question that we tried to ask was, what role does cognition play? Okay, and we wanted to look at that in the context of first episode psychosis, which is relatively, less researched in terms of looking at the various predictors of psychosis outcomes. And we also wanted to use sort of the new definitions of symptom improvement or symptom remission that Michael earlier spoke to you about, the consensus criteria for remission. So our basic question was, what role does cognition play when you also take into account symptom improvement using these sort of standardized consensus criteria for remission in first episode psychosis? Without sort of getting into really a lot of technical details, we did a series of hierarchical regression analysis. And what that simply means is that, you have to carefully think about the order in which you enter various predictors that you think would play a role. So here, for instance, our outcome variable was functioning, and the way we defined functioning was the number of friendships or social contacts, and employment in school. So those were the two sort of aspects of functioning that were looked at. And what we did was in step one, or in the first step, we introduced all sort of known or established predictors of outcomes in psychosis. So for example, we know that men tend to have poorer outcomes than women. So in the first block, we introduced all these typical or known predictors like duration of untreated psychosis, gender, medication adherence, age of onset, substance use, and premorbid adjustment, or the level of functioning prior to the onset of psychosis. In the next two blocks, we introduced more or less the chief variables of interest in our study, and we honed in really on verbal memory, given how it's been shown to be really an important cognitive variable in prior literature. So that's what we introduced in step 2, and in step 3, we looked at the maximum number of continuous months in total symptom remission. And we did this 1 year after treatment, so looking at functioning 1 year after treatment, and looking at functioning 2 years after treatment. And so this is the 1 year results. And what you find is that in block 2, where we had only introduced all sort of established predictors and verbal memory does seem to play a role. It emerged as a significant predictor, and this model accounted for about 9%. It explained about 9% of the variance in functioning. Then in block 3, when we have introduced the symptom remission variable, the maximum number of continuous months in total symptom remission, that's the only variable that seems to emerge as a significant predictor with a fairly large, with a fairly large beta weight, and explaining about 30% of the variance in functioning. Okay? Now at year 2, so if you directly look at block 3, so that's the model with all the predictors thrown in. What you would find are, this model again explained about 30% of the variance with 2 predictors seeming to emerge as significant: premorbid adjustment and the maximum consecutive months in total symptom remission. So if you had to just summarize this set of analyses, what we found was that cognition made a relatively modest but statistically significant contribution to functional outcomes at year 1, but not at year 2. And you also noticed that this contribution disappeared after taking into account symptom remission. So in conclusion, the main finding would be that longer periods of total remission were associated with better functioning at 1 and 2 years. We really wanted to sort of tease apart, and Michael sort of set the stage for that, this idea that we really need to look separately at not just positive symptoms, which typically seems to receive all the attention, but also at negative symptoms like lack of motivation or restricted emotional expressivity. So we wanted to look separately at the influence of positive symptom remission or improvement in positive symptoms and improvement in negative symptoms, and what role separately do they have to play in influencing functioning. So once again, we did a series of hierarchical regression analyses, where in the first block we introduced all the known predictors. In the second one, we introduced verbal memory, which was our chief cognitive variable of interest. And then separately, in the next 2 steps, we introduced positive symptom remission followed by negative symptom remission. And again, we did this 1 year after treatment and 2 years after treatment. So looking at how people were performing socially and in terms of work and school a year after treatment and 2 years after treatment. So what we found is that if you look at block 3, okay, so at this point you've introduced all your established known predictors, you've also put in verbal memory into your model, and you've just added positive symptom remission. So you've separated it out from negative symptom remission. And verbal memory still, it seems to be significant. And this model accounted for about 15% of the variance. But in the next block, when you add the negative symptom remission, the only 2 predictors that seem to be significant are age of onset and the maximum consecutive months in negative symptom remission. And you can see that this model accounts for a much larger percent of variance, about 35% of the variance in explaining functional outcomes at year 1. And at year 2, again, I'll direct your attention directly to the last sort of block, which explained about 38% of the variance in functional outcomes. And the variables that emerged as significant were age of onset, okay, so a premorbid adjustment or better level of functioning prior to the onset of psychosis, the maximum number of continuous months in positive symptom remission and in negative symptom remission. And you can tell by the beta weight differences that the biggest predictor seemed to be the number of continuous months in negative symptom remission. So just to sort of summarize this set of analyses, at year 1 of the predictors of chief interest, only consecutive months in negative symptom remission significantly predicted functioning. And at year 2, both longer periods of positive and negative symptom remission, but not cognition, significantly predicted functional outcomes, with the negative symptom status contributing the most. As I said earlier, I won't really have a lot of time to go into this sort of relationship with other illness aspects and neurocognition. And just to sort of throw in, we're not saying that cognition is not important, because there are complex relationships with other illness aspects through which it could still be influencing functional outcomes and clinical outcomes. We saw earlier the relationship with insight. We've shown earlier relationship between premorbid adjustment and neurocognition, and we just showed data suggesting a role for premorbid adjustment in all models at year 2. Sort of very briefly, some conclusions from the data that I've presented here today. This is sort of, again, demonstrating what is well established in the literature, that persons at ultra-high risk and those with first episode psychosis seem to often have significant cognitive difficulties. What's also interesting is that both persons with first episode psychosis and those at risk perceive themselves as having more cognitive difficulties and in many domains compared to their peers. I think we really need to better investigate and understand the implications of these subjectively perceived deficits, their associations with these important psychological variables like self-esteem, and also to sort of see whether these subjective perceptions are malleable, and if so, what impact do they have on functioning and on recovery and on people's sort of perceptions of efficacy and mastery. And finally, I think given the last set of analyses that I showed you, suggesting the importance of symptom remission, of sort of sustaining an improvement in symptoms, particularly of negative symptoms, we need better treatments for that. We know very well that we have very, very sort of limited tools when it comes to addressing negative symptoms. Thank you. Sorry, I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. Great presentation. So we have time. We're running a bit late, but we have time perhaps for one question.
I think everyone can.
There are two cognitive domains that was not included in your assessment. The procedural learning, which is known to be very often related to the medication we give, specifically the antipsychotic medication, and the social cognition, which is very related to the social context. So why do you think that could be included in your future research, and what would be the expected research?
We do assess social cognition, but it's such a vast area, and we assess it in a very limited sort of fashion. And I know that Dr. Lepage and one of his graduate students or postdocs did look at social cognitive deficits, and I do think that it is a very important area to be assessed in psychosis, and more and more research shows that that seems to have a lot of influence on outcomes. And what we mean by social cognition, the thing is it's so vast that you would need multiple measures just to assess social cognition. But that's a point well taken, that we do need to take into account those things. Thank you. I don't know if you...
Well, thank you again, Vidya.